The conversation continues, and it has been a compelling conversation this week. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Stanley Hauerwas. He comes to us by way of North Carolina, but I understand has some Texas roots. And many of you know him for his work as a theologian and an ethicist. He wrote some of the early essays on theology and intellectual disability. And for those of you who haven't read it, those were compiled into and co-edited by John Swinton into a double issue of the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health. I think might actually be back here. And he's also written and spoken on the L'Arche communities, and part of that conversation with Jean Vanier was also captured in a book entitled Living Gently in a Violent World, which I also think is on the back table. So make sure you check both of those out. He recently retired from teaching at Duke Divinity School, and we're pleased to have him here at the Summer Institute on Disability and Theology. He's going to discuss and reflect on some of his work around theology and disability. And after that, we'll have a time where you can reflect on and post questions before we go to a break. And after that break, we'll return for a time of discussion with Hans, John, and Stanley about some of these, the intersection of disability and theology. So if you will join me in welcoming Stanley Hauerwas.
Actually, I don't just happen to be here. This is where I was raised. About 10 miles from here, there's a little a town called Pleasant Grove that was my place of with my family, and I was raised. This is high cotton country in Highland Park. We were poor folks, and I was raised a bricklayer. So we laid brick all over this area. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome you here to my original and still deeply committed home. It's my as when John and Hans and I have the conversation, it's nice to know that I'm the only one without an accent. This is the way everyone is meant to talk. I've been asked to, Hans suggested that I say a bit about the background of the work that I've been doing over now 30 years concerned with theology and mental disabilities. When I went to the University of Notre Dame to teach, I was just a typical academic trying to figure out how to do theology in a academically respectable way. So, in other words, I was an absolute asshole, and which is a technical term here in Texas. I hadn't thought anything about what the challenge of mentally disabled people might present until I met a man named Harvey Bender, who was a wonderful colleague in genetics, a Jew at Notre Dame, who had gotten involved with Logan Center, which was across the street from Notre Dame. At the time, and Harvey was on the board of the local ARC, which met at Logan Center. At the time in Indiana, if you had an IQ below 89, you were not schooled. That was, so Logan Center had been built to provide some interaction for people with mental disabilities. There was also across the street from Notre Dame at that time the North Indiana Children's Hospital, where profoundly mentally disabled people were warehoused, and I use that term as you would recognize descriptively because of the terrible care that those folks were receiving. I was asked to serve after getting to know Harvey and being brought within the world of Logan Center. I was asked to serve on the board of the local Association for Retarded Citizens, which meant I was drawn into the world of the mentally handicapped in a way that I had not anticipated. You quickly discover, as a matter of fact, by being drawn into that world, things about your own life that you would prefer not to know. For example, when I was being given a tour around Logan Center early on, a young lad who had Down syndrome, I think he must have been about 7, came up to me. And as you know, sometimes spacing is different for people with Down syndrome. And he came up, and of course, you're trying to be a fairly decent human being, and you say, "Oh, hello, Michael." And he put his arms around me and got right up in my face and didn't let go. So I was, as I went around Logan Center, the building, I was carrying Michael, and he was right here the whole time. And of course, and I was, "Oh, how are you?" You know, blah, 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 blah. And all I could think of is this kid is scaring the shit out of me. And how can I get rid of him? Because I hadn't been around people that were mentally disabled, and I didn't know what different cues were being. I mean, we normally know, you know, how a kid will respond to different kinds of things you say, but he was frightening me, and I didn't want really to have to interact with him. That confrontation made me think that the vulnerable who cannot hope to hide their disability and their vulnerability remind us who we are. We're just like that. We're vulnerable, and we cannot hide our disability, but we're pretty good at it. He wasn't very good at it. And that very exposure to vulnerability, I thought, that's what we have to give some account for, because we reason that we want people with disability to be just like us is we do not want our vulnerabilities exposed with the kind of power that they cannot hide in terms of their own lives. So I began to think, after all, you're a theologian. If Michael scared the hell out of you, what does God do? What does seeing the face of God in Michael help us better to understand the world in which we find ourselves, and how the difference that God makes or should make for our lives? Of course, that situation I came to not entirely innocent. I am, after all, a person trained as a theologian and ethicist, whatever in the hell that would mean. I thought I saw, however, in Michael's vulnerability a fundamental challenge to the presumptions with which we live in modernity. That is, the fundamental presumption in modernity, it seems to me, is that we should be autonomous agents who make voluntary relations with other people in a manner that those relations are not coerced. My way of putting it is, the project of modernity is to produce people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. That's what we call freedom, that we should produce people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. Of course, Michael didn't get to choose his story. So the whole language of autonomy and freedom, I thought, was fundamentally challenged once you took seriously the reality of some that are born with mental disability. So I thought, and what I saw in Michael was a crack in the ideology of what might be called, in general, liberal political practice. That is, the presumption that you want to produce a world and a social order in which no one has to regard another except through their free consent. So I began to think that to come to terms with how we are brothers and sisters as mentally disabled and those who are not was a radical political challenge to the world in which we found ourselves. And that to develop an account of that would help us see the difference being Christian and the language we speak as Christians would have for the witness of being a people in the world who challenge the world to be what the world was created to be, God's good creation. That was a reminder that you do not need to justify the care of the mentally disabled. They rather are just part of the community that God has called into the world to be for the world God's time for helping us be a people who recognize that we have all the time in the world, a world of extraordinary injustice, to take the time to have children, some who will be born different. Now, that kind of patience I take to be an extraordinary challenge to the world in which we find ourselves, that is a world of speed, that is fueled by an extraordinary fear of death. Because exactly the reason that we are in such a hurry is because we want to avoid the reality that we are creatures destined to die. What I ask lay audiences, that is, audiences that are not associated with medicine, how they want to die. And everyone wants to die in modernity, quickly, painlessly, in their sleep, and without being a burden. They don't want to be a burden because they don't trust their children, obviously. They want to die quickly, painlessly, and in their sleep, because when they die, they don't have to know they're died. So now we ask physicians to keep us alive to the point that when we die, we don't have to know we're dying. And then we get to blame physicians for keeping us alive to no point. Now, disability and death are deeply interconnected, exactly because the information that somehow we have a vulnerability that we cannot ignore is exactly an intimation of death. It's very interesting. In the great litany in the Book of Common Prayer, we pray for God to save us from a sudden death. Now, you ask, well, what could have ever led people to pray to be saved from a sudden death? They prayed to be saved from a sudden death because they needed time to reconcile themselves with their enemies, which of course was with their family, with the church and with God, because they didn't want to die unreconciled. They feared God. We fear death. And therefore, we do not want a lingering death. Now, all of this came together for me when I was serving on the board, and later I spent 6 years of the board of the local ARC, and then I served on protective service, which was the group that was committed to giving legal representation for mentally handicapped people who had been basically abandoned. And it all came home to me during that time we were meeting as a board in protective service together. And the National Association for Retarded Citizens had sponsored a brief advertising campaign in which they were trying to compete with some of the other charitable institutions that were trying to get people to give monies for research to cure cancer, to help the deaf, to deal with those who are suffering from various forms of sight challenge. And this movie showed a young couple. The room was relatively dark, and they were standing before a crib, and you never saw who was in the crib. And they were in absolute despair. And the young mother looked into the camera and said, "Do not let this happen to you." We were so looking forward to the birth of our first child, and we had great expectations. We are devastated. Our child was born with mental retardation. They will never be what we expected. Do not let this happen to you. Prevent retardation. That was sponsored by the Association for Retarded Citizens. And we protested immediately. and it was quick. It didn't stay on the air very long. But they were trying to suggest that Association of Retarded Citizens was like analogous to Prevent Cancer. Only, of course, they had presumed, I mean, you can perhaps do something about someone's cancer without removing the subject who is suffering from cancer. But to prevent retardation meant you prevented this human being from existing. So what were you thinking of? I think, of course, that was partly a way to say we need money, and you cannot be too critical of people thinking they need money to do something about helping people live with mental retardation. But what I thought was behind that ad was the presumption that is connected with the idea you should have no story except the story you chose when you had no story. And that presumption is suffering is a very bad thing, and it is to be eliminated at all cost. Because if we are to be a people who know how to cooperate when we share little in common other than the fear of death and the relation of that fear to suffering, then it seems that what it means to be a progressive people is we need to eliminate suffering. And in particular, that means, and what people often fail to see, the elimination of people who suffer. And that is what I began to understand to be what could only be understood as a search and destroy mission against those suffering from mental disability. In particular, of course, it has everything to do with abortion. If you have amniocentesis and you discover the child is suffering from some disability, then the language becomes, we want to spare them a life of suffering. So it is better for them not to exist than to exist. Now, you begin just to the extent that you're ready to challenge that presumption. Just to the extent you're ready to challenge that presumption, you begin to see what a radical position it is politically for those in the kind of communities represented here to say, no, a child can be born with disability because our lives together are lives that each of us are given sufferings which we bear through sharing them with one another. And that is what I believe, of course, the church is about. Namely, the church is about the formation of a people who have learned that our suffering is bearable just to the extent it can be shared across time in a way that indeed time is created. For we Christians do not believe that we are a people who have no story except the story we chose when we had no story. Christians are a people who believe we have been born storied. Namely, we are creatures of a gracious God who has given us all we need to live in peace with one another in a world that is often filled with violence, fueled by our assumptions that we can make our lives safe by having only relations with other people that we have chosen. So those were the kinds of thoughts that I began to reflect upon and try to write about as I was drawn increasingly into the world of the mentally disabled. And it is a world, because one of the things I discovered were parents of the mentally disabled are tough people. They are tough people because they know that they have to challenge the presumptions, oftentimes, of those social organizations that say that they're going to help the disabled. How many parents have been told on the birth of a mentally disabled child, the best thing you can do is institutionalize this child right now? Yes. You were told that, right? And you had to learn real quick to say no. Yeah. How did you learn that? Right. Right. It came from within. Um, um, uh, how many of others have had that kind of experience? Right. It's exactly, and 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 one of the things to be able to say no is you suddenly have to become knowledgeable about the kinds of politics in which we exist to be able to say no. Though the problem is the very categories of understanding need to be challenged themselves if you are to be able to say there's an alternative to the ways that you think care is presumed about these kinds of matters. And you can't do that alone. You need all the help you can get. And so one of the things that I was trying to do was to try to see what it meant not to be alone in terms of how, because suffering produces a kind of aloneness. You're not sure how it can be shared. And then I wasn't sure what any of this looked like. And then I discovered Jean Vanier. And it was with Jean Vanier that it wasn't that I wasn't, as a theologian, I wasn't sure what Christianity looked like. As a theologian, I wasn't sure of what it meant to see a world in which those suffering from mental disability were not seen as somehow just the recipient of care, rather than also a gift. And it was through seeing and reading the great book Community and Growth, and as well as beginning to get an understanding of how L'Arche was organized in a way that the core members were the core members in a way that trained those who were there to allegedly do far someone turned out to have their lives transformed by learning to be with. So it was through the work of Jean Vanier that I began to understand that it's not so much how we need to do something for someone. It's how we learn to be with and be present with the mentally disabled and other disabled people in a manner that presence says, I'm not going away. Because that's who God is with us. God is, I am with you. And that presence makes possible a people able to live in a world where deep violence is possessing lives. And yet we know peace comes through the learning of being with in a manner that we don't need to eliminate those that are frightening us because they cannot hide their vulnerability. So that was the kind of perspective that I had learned from being pulled into the world of the mentally disabled in a manner that transformed not only how I saw the world, but how I began, I hope, to understand what it meant for God to save the world through a cross and resurrection. That's what and how I've tried to think about these matters. I'd love to get any responses that you have to that.
So we want to open it up for a time of dialogue for about a half an hour, and I'm sure questions and reflections are brewing, so John and I will circulate around and take those.
Hello, my name's Wes. Thank you for that. I was interested in your views. You know, institutions have changed a lot, and I'd like to hear your current views on that versus community living options and institutions, and just where you're at on all that.
I quite frankly don't know enough about how institutions have changed. I mean, I've always been I think Wolf Wolfensberger's principle had an effect on institutions in terms of the principle of normalization. My only problem with the principle of normalizations and how they became institutionalized is, of course, I can't imagine anything worse than being normal. I'm a Texan. I mean, normality sounds like some kind of conspiracy by people from the North to try to make us correspond to their way of life. How you think about the best way to have institutional residency in a way that provides an acknowledgement of people's differences, I think continues to be a big challenge. I remember, I think we have less day rooms than we had 20 years ago. I remember in South Bend, we had a nursing home called Cardinal Nursing Home. And it was where the state would oftentimes just warehouse people with various disabilities. And if you went into the day room, I mean, there would be someone sitting in their own waste. There would be someone headbanging. there'd be someone masturbating and so on. And so you would have maybe 20 or 30 people in this room. And if anyone would walk into a room like that, anyone that is who hadn't had a background with people with mental disability, if you walked into a room like that, you would say, it would be better off if these people didn't exist. If you turned those, but if you, as we did, tried to develop residential housing in which no more than 4 or 5 people would be in the house with appropriate assistance. This was before I knew anything about Vanier. Then, as a matter of fact, if you came into that house, you would say, this is really wonderful to see how these people are learning to live together. Now, so the development of institutional forms that express the humanity of the people that are living in those contexts is absolutely crucial. And what I discovered, or I've discovered over the years about that, is there's no sure formula that will make that occur, because everything depends, as much as we might not like it, on people and the kind of people that are part and parcel of that. I mean, that, as you know, in L'Arche communities, people, lovely people, want to become part of a L'Arche community because they're so desperate to discover their own moral identity by doing something good for somebody. And they're frustrated as everything because and oftentimes the mentally disabled have wonderful abilities to resist our desire to do some good. And of course the language of that is burnout. And exactly knowing how, I mean, what's one of the great secrets of L'Arche? Birthday celebrations. Because it's exactly that when you celebrate that you begin to discover your commonality and your so I mean that doesn't sound like such a big deal, the discovery of birthday celebrations, but it is, as a matter of fact, one of the great transformations of how you learn to live together in that way. So those are my reflections about that. How much I'd be interested in, what is your view about what's happened institutionally?
Well, I'm a chaplain for the state of Texas, and I work at a state supported living center. And so, we obviously support community living options, but for a lot of the residents, they've been there their whole life. Right. And from my perspective, our facility does a really good job of making that, its own little community with outings and things like that. Birthdays are very important. I have residents who have birthdays several times a year. And,
oh, right. Oh, no, it's great.
Yeah, every time I'm happy with them, and I say it's their birthday. And I also joke there's a resident who I'll always know her birthday. I have 5 kids, and it takes me a while to get their birthdays. But she tells me every day I see her, right. Her birthday's August 19th. Right. So little things like that, providing choice and options. And from what I read previously, obviously, and talking with others, it has been atrocious. And I think that people's perceptions a lot of times of institutions are what you're saying is just, bad place and things like that. So
I think one of the other things that's so important is how touching it becomes so crucial, because oftentimes people are not touched except to be given a pill or something like that. Yes. There's a question over here.
Hi, my name is Susan. Thanks for your talk. And I actually want to follow up a little bit on this question. Because we are a global church, I recognize that institutions have changed in the United States, in most cases for the better, in the past couple of decades, but that certainly doesn't speak to the rest of the world and people who live with disabilities in the rest of the world. I mean, in my family, we recently adopted a child from Ukraine who has CP and also has an intellectual disability, and he was literally stuck in a corner for 5 years.
Wow.
And the place where he was, actually by Ukrainian standards, was pretty good. And the people who were there were certainly trying. They were, it was like one adult to 20 20 disabled children. There was just no way they could give the care that was needed. But a lot of people come to us and talk to us a lot about his physical disabilities and try, how do we work together to help him there, his mental disabilities in the school system. But the main thing that we're dealing with is this is a traumatized child. Institution did not make his life any better by any stretch of the imagination, and that's what we're going to be dealing with for the next few years. So what can we do as a church to try to speak out against how people with disabilities are treated beyond our own backyard? Not ignoring those who are in our own backyard, but what can we do as a global church?
One of the most challenging realities that I have ever encountered is seeing photographs of Romanian orphans who have lived their lives in cribs in which they have never been touched. And the pathos of their eyes is enough to drive you mad, because not having been touched means they are incapable of touch. And I don't know how to, quote, ever understand how such a terror can be accepted by another human being. So I suppose the question obviously I have no answer to a question like you raise, but as Christians, we are connected as Christians around the world in a manner that creates, hopefully, knowledge that you just indicated that can help us name for one another a reality that we need to respond to. That's what it means for the church. I have on my office door the Mennonite poster that shows two anguished people holding one another, and then it says, "A modest proposal for peace. Let the Christians of the world resolve not to kill one another." People sometimes knock on my door and say, "That makes me so bad." And I said, "Why?" They said, "Well, they shouldn't kill anyone." And I said, "They call it a modest proposal. You need to begin somewhere." The modest proposal, what it means for the church to be Catholic is the stories that you relate of Christians in Eastern Europe also are our stories, and our stories are their stories, and the agencies to make those one is absolutely crucial. And for what it means for us to be a people capable of living peaceably in a world who won't kill other people. And I think it does have much to do with a discovery of nonviolence and what it means to acknowledge the other's suffering in a way that I don't have to eliminate them. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to get back to what you were saying about the need for people to be touched and held, which I completely agree with. However, in Canada now, there is a great emphasis on not being allowed to judge because of various kinds of physical sexual abuses. And I think that's really sad because everyone needs a hug. I'm not sure how or if possible to get a middle ground. Maybe you could speak on how we can still have intimate contact, but also have guidelines on how far that goes.
If 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, it is also the time when the mentally disabled and other forms of other people with disabilities are excluded from Christian worship. And interestingly, which is a way of indicating in some ways that many forms of worship are far too rationalistic. And interestingly enough, the more the higher so-called higher forms of liturgical expression are oftentimes more inviting because for people that are with certain disabilities, exactly because it's about the body. And the body can do all kinds of wonderful things in terms of shaping and being shaped by liturgical forms. So if I sometimes think, Protestants tend to be often when they go into church, they think they need to whisper, and because they need to whisper, I think they need to whisper because if they're not particularly holy, then they think God doesn't show up. And I notice that Catholics have a completely different view about this. They go into church and say, "Hi, Jack," and so in a way that they know God is going to show up irrespective of their subjectivities, because when you celebrate the Mass, you celebrate the Mass. And so they're ready to stand a good deal more disruption. And God is just another name for disruption. So exactly, I think, how Christians understand the role of worship and its centrality for the disabled being not something special, but simply part of the kind of of life we Christians should embody as a people capable of worshiping this extraordinary God that we find in Jesus Christ, is one of the ongoing challenges we face. But I think that there is some changes there. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Nancy Webb. As a pastor, I have been blessed to be connected with at least 2 families that I'm thinking of right now. They both had children who were somewhere on the autism spectrum, and one had many more multiple handicaps than that. But there was never the slightest question in their mind that they loved and accepted their children and did all that they possibly could for them and whatnot. And sweet little Aaron and sweet little John each grew, perhaps in wisdom and in stature, no doubt. And as they grew in stature, the frustrations and anger within them made it possible that they could totally, physically overtake their loving parent and provide all manner of violence to their parent. And the parents felt guilt about the fact that if they, as human beings, were going to survive at that stage of their sweet little child, now grown up's life, if they were going to be alive tomorrow with all of their limbs, they simply felt, and I believe, needed to institutionalize their children, at least for some time, until the medication and developmental stage and whatever all it was able to be sort of evened out. So I sit here speaking on behalf of supporting loving parents who feel that they've reached a stage where they just need more help than they can provide in their own home.
Yeah. I don't have any wisdom about that. I mean, reality is reality. I do, the description I understand, and I've certainly have friends who have had similar challenges, and I take what strikes me is, how do you develop wisdom about what kinds of behaviors can you hopefully learn that will make those kinds of frustrations less expressed through violent reaction. And that is a challenge, not just for those parents, but for communities, to try to do the best thinking we can, and to discover the habits of that might make it less likely. But look, no one, this is not a game of you did wrong and you did right. It's too serious for that kind of judgment. What does strike me is how you overcome, again, is how you overcome how those parents who are having to make those decisions are not left alone, and their aloneness in that is shareable by a community in a way that they do not feel abandoned just simply because their child is autistic. John, yes? Oh.
Yes, first of all, I was a volunteer at Logan Center, so I know
Oh,
the
really?
place well. And secondly, I actually, almost 30 years ago, had Professor Bender, and was one of the best classes I ever had, and I am grateful because it also expanded my world of science, since I didn't pass and had to take another science class.
Do we know one another?
Sir?
Do we know one another?
No, sir, I don't think so.
I see, my goodness, what an interesting...
Yeah, but share that connection with you.
Yeah.
So, but I love I continue to love Professor Bender. My question is about suffering that you mentioned, and we had an opportunity to discuss this on our first day with Professor Amos. And what came to mind then, and I shared with the group, was what John Sobrino, the Jesuit theologian, once said about that suffering and joy go together. You cannot separate them. You have to say suffering and joy. That joy is not the antithesis of suffering. And I think that oftentimes there is that divide, that separation. He said falsehood is actually more the antithesis of suffering.
What is?
Falsehood,
Falsehood.
inauthenticity.
Right.
So in the world in which, the real world in which we live, how can we, in the North American context, in Christian communities and other communities of faith, talk about suffering in a way that is not, that is life-giving, actually, that you can talk about suffering and joy, because in a Latin American context, suffering is a value. It's valued as
Right.
something. But here it's very antiseptic, and if you bring that up, you're un-American, I mean, that's...
You can suffer from joy.
That's my wife's name, by the way.
No, I mean, it's interesting the difference between joy and happiness is understood.
Yes.
People think they want to be happy, but what really, and they want to be happy because they think they will be in control of what it is that satisfies. But joy is always a surprise that that takes us unawares in ways that means that we're put out of control. I hadn't expected that at all, and I mean, it's very interesting. Joy is one, and for Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian of the last century, joy is at the heart of his theology, because joy names our God's engagement with us in ways that we could not have anticipated. So most of us are frightened of being joyful. But once joy possesses us, we cannot help but learn to acknowledge it and learn to live in the light of it. And joy, therefore, and suffering is also a surprise, of which, I mean, sometimes we think we live our lives prospectively, but it's only retrospectively that we can make sense of them. And oftentimes, what we thought I often, when I say to people, the challenge, you should have no story except the story you chose when you had no story. if you don't believe that's your story, I can illustrate it this way. Do you feel like you should be held responsible for decisions you made when you did not know what you were doing? No, you, on the whole, don't feel like you should be held responsible for decisions you made when you did not know what you were doing. And then I point out the only problem with that, it makes marriage unintelligible. Because how could you possibly know what you did when you promised lifelong monogamous fidelity? And if it makes marriage unintelligible, try having children. You never get the ones you want. And so exactly, you thought you knew what you were doing when you had your children, and then you learn you suffer them. But it's exactly retrospectively that you learn to re-narrate that in a way that makes you joyful in that way. So those are the ways I try to think about it.
Thank you very much for your sharing of your story and your reflections. I particularly love the story of Michael, you encountering Michael, and just have a couple of questions in a couple different ways. One is that after your encounter with Michael, you could have forgotten about him and walked away, but you didn't. So I'm curious as about what was, if you have reflected about what was in you or what was in your story that made you pursue that encounter further. And then secondly, as someone who's been a part of the academy for a long time, perhaps knows a little bit about what academics think, I wonder if you might know some practices or some conspiracies perhaps to facilitate encounters with people like Michael and other academics, because this seemed to have a significant influence on your life and upon your subsequent theological work, quote unquote.
I say this, I didn't walk away from Michael because I began to understand what he represented is just so damned intellectually interesting. I don't say that in praise of, as kind of false confessionalism or feeling terribly guilty, but I thought, wow, this, as I said, this is the fact that Michael exists is a challenge to some of our most basic presuppositions about how our lives are to be lived that I think Christians want to call into question. So it was an intellectual. I'm terrible because I'm attracted to that, but it was also that I'm just an antagonistic son of a bitch, and I just liked what the world that I saw at Logan Center as a world of that was an alternative to the desert of the world in which so much of us live. As far as I think the modern university is a desert of ambition. And there are two things you can't ask around the modern university. You can't ask, what's it for and who does it serve? It drives academics crazy to be asked what is for and who do you serve. It obviously serves the state, and that's not all bad. And what it's for is for the ambitions of the academics who make it up. I think nothing would be more significant for the modern university than to have at its center a L'Arche home to remind us that in a world of speed, there could be nothing more important than having time slowed down to say, what could be more significant than to learn to live and eat with people who it takes time for their lives to be lived in a manner that is humanly significant and flourishing for both them and for us. So I mean, that's a very despairing view of the modern university and what can be done, but I think that that's I think that's the reality in which we find ourselves.
Hi, I'm Judith Sokolow from Austin, and I appreciate your comments. I'd like to go back to suffering. I mean, not personally, but I'd like us to go back to suffering sort of existentially. But there's suffering that randomly falls into our lives, and then there's our collective societal drive to make matters worse by creating waiting lists that people can't get into decent housing. We've certainly made lots of comments about the medical model over the last few days and the way in which it can harm people, but there are millions of people who don't have access to medicine, to the medical model. We, as a society, risk being really glib, I think, if we don't recognize our hand in creating suffering. And we can't just say, well, there's growth and so forth by being able to deal with suffering, or you're not ever given more than you can handle. That kind of lets us off the hook from our own suffering. And I'm wondering if you could help us with that, reflect on that.
I think that there's a distinction that might be useful. One, there is the kind of suffering that is commensurate with the kinds of projects that we have undertaken. The fact that you want to be an academic means you have to suffer going through PhD work, something like that. So that those kinds of sufferings we think are explicable, and we're ready to accept them. What we're not ready to accept are the kinds of sufferings that are not, that seem a challenge to our projects which we haven't chosen. My view is that what part of it means to be a Christian is to acknowledge that those sufferings that we haven't chosen can be and should be part of a flourishing that makes possible our relationships with others that otherwise wouldn't be possible. I mean, it's very interesting. I always think, I mean, the question, why do bad things happen to good people? How could that question ever be asked by people that read the Psalms? I mean, the Psalms say, I've been pretty good. I kept the law. My enemies are beating the hell out of me, and even my friend has betrayed me. But you are God. Now, I take it, but you are God is a way of saying there's going to be a way that I can, that I will learn what all this is about for God's care of God's people in a way that makes me non-resentful, and that is a gift, but it is oftentimes a hard and dreadful gift. I mean, obviously, the kinds of questions you're raising there's no, I mean, it is part of the human condition, and it doesn't go away, and we need all the help we can give one another for that. One more.
We have time for one more question here.
Yeah.
This is more of a sharing, as we've been talking about some of the residential options and the kind of, I guess, the backlash we have sometimes against the word institution. And I just wanted to share, west of where I live in Houston, there's a town of Brookshire that has a community called the Brookwood community. I see some heads nodding, so there's a little familiarity in the room. But it's very much focused at a holistic look at the whole person as well as community. And folks come in and they really try to find what the gift and what the key is that that particular individual has, and they're a contributing member within that community. And one of the great things is they've started something called network days that they do 4 times a year, so folks can come and say, how do we learn how to do this model and replicate it other places? So if anyone's interested in learning more about that community and how you could get connected, just look for me, and I'd be glad to share. I've lived near them for 20 years and have a pretty strong relationship.
That's really how to discern someone's gift. This person really is good at planting petunias, while this person is really good at cooking something. I mean, that's so important. And of course, and the gifts will change across time and that kind of thing. Just like, discernment of gifts is absolutely at the heart of any good community. It takes time, and that's what we think God has given us. And thank you for giving me this time. Thank you.